Right before we dive in, let's make this story bigger than just me and you. Tell me in the comments, what part of the world are you watching from? And what's the clock striking there? Morning, night, or somewhere in between, I want to see how far this story can reach. Now lean closer. Here's where it all begins. The gunshot echoed across the desert mesa just as Céleste Moreau hit the final note of the ballad that would either save her life or seal her fate forever. Blood was already pooling beneath the man who had tried to silence her voice permanently, his smoking revolver lying useless in the dust while she stood frozen at the edge of the canyon, her song hanging in the air like a prayer that had been answered with violence instead of salvation. Behind her, Lucien Beauregard slowly lowered his own smoking gun, his face a mask of anguish as he realized what his protection had cost them both. The man he had just killed wasn't just another hired gun. He was the federal marshal who had been hunting them both across 3 territories, and his death would bring every lawman in the Southwest down on their heads like vultures descending on carrion. "That was the song," Céleste whispered, her voice breaking as she turned to face the man who had composed the melody that was supposed to be their salvation, but had instead become their doom. "The one you wrote for my voice, the one that was going to make us famous in San Francisco. And now—" Her words trailed off as she stared at the dead marshal, understanding that their dreams of legitimate success had died with him in the red dust of Arizona territory. Lucien's hands were shaking as he holstered his weapon, the same hands that had spent countless nights writing music for the woman he loved more than his own life. "He was going to kill you," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had just sacrificed everything for love. "I couldn't let him take away the most beautiful voice in the territories, even if it means we can never stop running now." The sound of approaching horses in the distance told them both that their time for grieving was over. Other lawmen were coming, drawn by the gunshot that had shattered their hopes along with the morning silence. As Céleste looked into Lucien's eyes, she saw the wild cowboy she had spent 2 years trying to tame. But now she understood that some men were meant to be wild, and that sometimes love meant running toward danger together rather than away from it. 6 months earlier, Lucien Beauregard had been the kind of man that respectable women crossed the street to avoid. A gun for hire whose reputation for violence was matched only by his reputation for drinking, gambling, and leaving broken hearts scattered across the frontier like spent cartridge cases. But everything changed the night he walked into the Silver Moon Saloon in Tucson and heard a voice that seemed to reach directly into his soul and rearrange everything he thought he knew about beauty and purpose. Céleste Moreau stood on the tiny stage in a dress of midnight blue silk, her voice weaving through a French ballad that transformed the rough saloon into something approaching a cathedral. She wasn't just singing, she was casting spells with sound, making hardened cowboys weep openly and causing gamblers to forget their cards as they lost themselves in melodies that spoke of love and loss and dreams that seemed possible in the presence of such impossible beauty. Lucien had come to the Silver Moon hunting a man who owed money to the wrong people, but he found himself unable to concentrate on business while Céleste's voice filled the air around him like smoke from a sacred fire. He sat in the back corner nursing whiskey and watching her perform, understanding for the first time in his violent life what people meant when they talked about being struck by lightning or touched by angels. When her set ended and she stepped down from the stage, Lucien found himself moving toward her without conscious thought, drawn by something stronger than desire or professional curiosity. Other men had tried to approach her throughout the evening, but she had deflected their advances with polite coldness that suggested she was accustomed to protecting herself from unwanted attention in the dangerous world of frontier entertainment. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," Lucien said when he finally worked up the courage to speak to her, his usual swagger replaced by genuine awe that made his voice sound younger and more vulnerable than it had in years. "Where did you learn to sing like that?" The question was simple, But her answer would change both their lives in ways neither of them could have imagined as they stood in that smoky saloon surrounded by the sounds of civilization trying to take root in the wilderness. Celeste's story unfolded like a tragic opera. Each revelation more heartbreaking than the last, as she told Lucien about the conservatory in New Orleans, where she had trained under masters who recognized her extraordinary talent, and the family scandal that had destroyed her chances of a legitimate career in respectable concert halls. Her father, Céleste Moreau, had been a prominent cotton merchant whose involvement with illegal slave trading had been exposed just as Celeste was preparing for her debut with the New Orleans Opera Company. The scandal had made her name poison in polite society, doors slamming shut across the cultural world as association with the Moreau family became a liability that no respectable institution could afford. Overnight, she had gone from being the most promising young soprano in Louisiana to being an outcast whose only option for survival was the dangerous world of frontier entertainment, where talent mattered more than family reputation, but where other dangers lurked in every shadow. "I've been running for 3 years," she told Lucien, as they sat in her small room above the saloon, her voice soft but steady as she revealed the depths of her exile from everything she had once known. "Every time I start to build something, start to find a place where my voice can be heard without shame, someone recognizes my name or my face, and I have to disappear again before the whispers start and the decent people begin to shun me." Lucien listened with growing anger, not at her, but at a world that would punish an innocent woman for her father's crimes, that would waste such extraordinary talent because of family connections she had never chosen and could never escape. His own experience with injustice and social prejudice made him understand her pain in ways that surprised them both, creating a connection that went deeper than mere attraction or professional admiration. "What if I told you there was a way to make them listen?" Lucien asked, his mind already working on possibilities that his violent background had taught him to see. "What if we could create something so beautiful, so perfect, that it would force the world to forget your name and remember only your voice?" The promise was audacious and probably impossible, but the hope that flickered in Celeste's eyes told him that even impossible dreams were worth pursuing when they were shared with someone who understood the price of being an outcast. What followed was the most unexpected education of Lucien's violent life, as Celeste began the patient work of transforming a killer into a composer while he provided her with the protection she needed to pursue her art without constantly looking over her shoulder for threats. She taught him to read music the way he had once learned to read tracks and weather patterns, showing him how emotion could be captured in notes and measures just as surely as a man's intentions could be read in his posture and the way he wore his guns. Lucien discovered that he had an intuitive understanding of melody and rhythm that surprised them both, his ear for music developing rapidly under Celeste's patient guidance, while his natural creativity found new outlets in composition rather than destruction. The same intensity that had made him deadly with a gun now drove him to spend hours crafting melodies that would showcase Celeste's extraordinary voice, writing music that captured the beauty and danger of frontier life in ways that traditional ballads never could. Their partnership was unconventional but remarkably effective. Lucien's reputation for violence kept the usual predators at bay, while Celeste's influence gradually civilized his behavior and channeled his artistic impulses into constructive rather than destructive directions. He stopped drinking heavily, gave up gambling, and found himself more interested in writing songs than taking contracts for violence, though he never stopped wearing his guns or practicing his deadly skills. The music they created together was unlike anything the frontier had heard before. Classical technique applied to Western themes, sophisticated melodies that told stories of cowboys and outlaws and settlers with the same emotional depth that European composers brought to tales of kings and knights. Celeste's voice transformed Lucien's rough-hewn compositions into something magical, while his understanding of frontier life gave her performances and authenticity that resonated with audiences who had lived those experiences. But even as their artistic partnership flourished and their personal relationship deepened into something that felt like love, both of them understood that they were living borrowed time in a world where pasts had a way of catching up with people who thought they had escaped them. The federal marshal who had been hunting Lucien for previous killings was getting closer, while Celeste's family scandal continued to follow her like a shadow that threatened to destroy any hope of legitimate success they might achieve together. The plan that emerged from their growing partnership was ambitious enough to be called crazy, but it was also the only path they could see toward a future that didn't involve constant running or the eventual violent end that awaited most outlaws who refused to give up their guns. San Francisco was experiencing a cultural renaissance that rivaled anything happening in New York or Boston, with new theaters and opera houses opening monthly to serve the wealthy elite who had made fortunes in gold and silver and now wanted to prove their sophistication by patronizing the arts. "They don't care about your family's past in San Francisco," Lucien argued as they discussed their options in the relative safety of a hotel room in Phoenix. "All they care about is whether you can make them feel cultured and refined. If we can get you on stage in one of the major theaters with music that's sophisticated enough to impress the critics but Western enough to feel authentic, you could become the voice of the new American frontier." Celeste's eyes shone with hope as she imagined performing in real theaters again, before audiences who came to hear music rather than to drink and gamble and fight. The thought of singing in acoustically perfect concert halls, accompanied by full orchestras rather than tinny saloon pianos, was intoxicating enough to make the considerable risks seem worthwhile. "But how do we get there?" she asked practically. "How do we convince theater owners to book an unknown singer with a scandalous past?" Lucien's smile was confident as he outlined the strategy he had been developing, a plan that would use his knowledge of wealthy men's weaknesses and Celeste's extraordinary talent to create opportunities that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. "We start by recording your voice," he said, pulling out a small recording device he had acquired through means he didn't explain. "New technology that captures sound on wax cylinders. We send recordings to theater owners and music critics. Let them hear what you can do before they know anything about who you are." The recording sessions that followed were magical experiences that convinced them both that their plan might actually work, as Lucien's compositions and Celeste's voice combined to create something that transcended the sum of their individual talents. But even as they worked toward their dream of legitimate success, the sound of approaching danger grew louder with each passing day, in the form of a federal marshal named Harrison Cole, who had been tracking Lucien across 3 territories and was now closing in on his quarry with the patience and determination of a man who had never failed to bring in his target. Marshal Harrison Cole was the kind of lawman who made outlaws wake up in cold sweats, a methodical tracker whose reputation for bringing in fugitives dead or alive had earned him fear and respect across the entire Southwest. He had been hunting Lucien Beauregard for 8 months, following a trail of witnesses and rumors that led from the blood-soaked saloons of Texas to the mining camps of Colorado, always staying one step behind his quarry but gaining ground with each new lead. Cole's investigation had revealed the transformation that Lucien was undergoing, the shift from hired killer to aspiring composer, but the marshal viewed this change with skepticism rather than hope. In his experience, killers didn't reform. They just found new ways to be dangerous, and a man with Lucien's violent skills would always represent a threat to innocent people regardless of his current artistic pursuits. The marshal's files on Lucien made for grim reading. 17 confirmed kills, all of them technically legal under the loose interpretation of self-defense that frontier justice allowed, but many of them suspiciously convenient for the people who had paid Lucien's fees. Cole had interviewed witnesses who painted a picture of a man who provoked confrontations with mathematical precision, creating situations where violence was inevitable, but where he always emerged as the legal survivor. But it was Lucien's association with Céleste Moreau that had given Cole the break he needed to close the distance between hunter and prey. The woman's distinctive voice and appearance made her memorable to witnesses, and her performances left a trail that was much easier to follow than the careful anonymity that had protected Lucien during his purely criminal years. Love, Cole reflected with professional satisfaction, made even the smartest fugitives vulnerable. The marshal's latest information placed his quarry in Phoenix, where reliable witnesses had seen them performing together and making inquiries about travel arrangements to California. Cole's network of contacts suggested that they were planning something ambitious, possibly an attempt to establish legitimate careers in San Francisco's thriving cultural scene. But Marshal Cole had no intention of allowing Lucien Beauregard to escape justice by reinventing himself as a respectable citizen. Some debts could only be paid in blood, and the families of Lucien's victims deserved to see their loved one's killer face the consequences of his actions. The wax cylinder recordings that Lucien and Céleste created in a makeshift studio above a Phoenix music shop captured something magical. The raw emotion of frontier life transformed into sophisticated art through the combination of Lucien's powerful compositions and Céleste's otherworldly voice. When they played back the first successful recording, both of them felt tears streaming down their faces as they heard their collaboration transformed into something that seemed to transcend the limitations of the primitive recording technology. The songs told stories that were uniquely American, tales of love and loss on the frontier, of dreams pursued across vast distances, of the courage required to build something beautiful in a land where violence was never far away. Lucien's melodies captured the sweep of Western landscapes, while Céleste's voice added emotional depth that made each story feel personal and immediate, creating music that was both sophisticated enough for educated audiences and authentic enough for people who had lived the experiences being described. Their first major breakthrough came when they sent a recording to Marcus Whitman, the owner of San Francisco's prestigious Golden Gate Opera House, a man whose ear for talent was matched by his understanding of what audiences wanted to hear. Whitman's response arrived by telegraph 3 days later, and the words were everything they had dared to hope for. Voice extraordinary, music revolutionary, come immediately for audition. Will advance travel expenses. The validation was intoxicating, proof that their impossible dream might actually be achievable if they could just survive long enough to reach San Francisco and transform their recordings into live performances. Céleste practically glowed with excitement as she read and reread the telegram, while Lucien felt a pride and satisfaction that was completely different from anything his violent career had ever provided. But even as they celebrated their artistic breakthrough and began planning their journey to California, neither of them noticed the man watching from across the street. Marshal Cole, who had finally tracked them down and was now deciding whether to arrest Lucien immediately or follow them to San Francisco and take him in a location where there would be fewer opportunities for violent resistance. The choice he made would determine whether their dream of legitimate success would ever become reality, or whether it would die in the dust of an Arizona street along with the man who had dared to believe that killers could become composers. The stagecoach journey from Phoenix to San Francisco should have been a time of anticipation and hope, but Lucien's instincts for danger kept him constantly alert as they traveled through mountain passes and desert valleys where ambush was always possible. He had noticed the same face too many times in Phoenix, a tall, weathered man with the bearing of a lawman, and his experience with hunters told him that they were being followed by someone with professional skills and patience. Céleste was too excited about their upcoming audition to pay much attention to Lucien's paranoia, spending hours reviewing her repertoire and discussing how to present their music to sophisticated San Francisco audiences who would expect European standards of performance. Her voice practice during rest stops drew crowds of fellow travelers who found themselves temporarily transported from the harsh realities of frontier travel to a world where beauty and art still mattered. The contrast between Céleste's innocent enthusiasm and Lucien's growing tension created an emotional undertone that made their journey feel like a race against time, with dreams of artistic success competing against the inexorable approach of violent justice. Lucien found himself writing new music during the long hours of travel, melodies that captured his growing sense of foreboding while providing vehicles for Céleste's voice that were more complex and emotionally sophisticated than anything he had composed before. Their first night in a way-station hotel provided a brief respite from the tension of travel, but it also brought confirmation of Lucien's fears when he spotted their pursuer through the window. Definitely a lawman, definitely tracking them, and definitely close enough to strike whenever he chose. The realization that their escape was an illusion forced Lucien to confront the possibility that his violent past would destroy Céleste's future just when it seemed most promising. "We're being followed," he told her quietly as they prepared for sleep, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that their dreams might be about to collide with reality in the most violent way possible. "A federal marshal, probably here for me rather than you, but dangerous to both of us as long as we're traveling together. We might have to make some hard choices about how much risk you're willing to accept for the chance at success in San Francisco." Céleste's response to Lucien's warning revealed depths of courage that surprised them both, as she made it clear that she had no intention of abandoning him to face danger alone regardless of what that choice might cost her dreams of musical success. "We're partners," she said simply, her voice carrying the same strength that made her performances so compelling. "In music and in life. If they want you, they'll have to go through me first." The remainder of their journey became a careful balance between moving toward their goal and avoiding the trap that was clearly being prepared for them, with Lucien using all his experience as both hunter and hunted to stay one step ahead of Marshal Cole, while Céleste provided emotional strength that kept him focused on their shared future rather than his violent past. Their love had become both their greatest vulnerability and their greatest source of strength. San Francisco emerged from the coastal mist like a city from a fairy tale, its steep hills and elegant architecture promising sophistication and opportunity that seemed almost too good to be real after months in the rough frontier territories. The Golden Gate Opera House was everything they had imagined and more. A temple to artistic achievement that made Céleste's voice catch with emotion as she imagined performing on its stage before audiences who understood and appreciated serious music. Marcus Whitman proved to be exactly the kind of cultural entrepreneur that the frontier needed, a man with the vision to recognize revolutionary talent and the business acumen to make that talent profitable for everyone involved. His reaction to hearing Céleste sing live was immediate and enthusiastic, offering her a contract that would make her one of the highest-paid performers on the West Coast, while giving Lucien's compositions the kind of professional production they deserved. But even as they celebrated what seemed like the fulfillment of their impossible dream, Lucien's attention was focused on the man he had spotted watching the opera house from across the street, Marshal Cole, who had followed them all the way to San Francisco and was now preparing to close the trap that would either end Lucien's life or destroy their chance at legitimate success. The moment of triumph was about to become a moment of reckoning, and the choice between love and justice was no longer theoretical, but immediate and deadly. The Golden Gate Opera House filled with anticipation as San Francisco's cultural elite gathered for what Marcus Whitman had promised would be the most important audition in the theater's history. Wealthy patrons who had built fortunes in gold and silver now sought to build cultural legacies that would establish San Francisco as America's Western cultural capital, and they had come to hear the voice that might make their city's reputation as a center for serious art. Céleste stood in the wings wearing a gown of deep emerald silk that had been provided by the theater's costume department, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and terror as she prepared to perform for an audience whose approval could change her life forever. Lucien was in the orchestra pit with a small ensemble of professional musicians, his compositions about to receive their first performance by artists who understood classical technique and could do justice to his sophisticated arrangements. The first song was a ballad about love on the frontier, Lucien's melody weaving through themes of separation and reunion, while Céleste's voice soared above the orchestration with emotion that made grown men weep openly. The audience was immediately captivated, leaning forward in their seats as they recognized that they were witnessing something extraordinary, the birth of a uniquely American form of musical expression that was sophisticated enough for international stages, but authentic enough to capture the reality of frontier experience. But even as Céleste's voice filled the theater with beauty that transcended anything the audience had heard before, Lucien's attention was split between conducting the ensemble and watching for Marshal Cole, who he knew had to be somewhere in the building waiting for the right moment to make his arrest. The tension between artistic triumph and impending violence created an emotional undertone that made the performance even more powerful, as if the music itself understood that it might be the last collaboration between composer and singer. The applause that followed their first song was thunderous, but it was interrupted by the sound that Lucien had been dreading, the metallic click of a revolver being cocked somewhere in the darkened theater. Marshal Cole had decided that the time for waiting was over, and the audition that was supposed to launch their legitimate careers was about to become the stage for a confrontation that would determine whether love and art could triumph over violence and the demands of frontier justice. Lucien Beauregard. Marshal Cole's voice cut through the applause like a blade through silk, his authority carrying across the theater as he emerged from the shadows with his weapon drawn and his badge glinting in the stage lights. "You're under arrest for multiple counts of murder. Step away from the lady and surrender yourself to federal justice." The formal words carried the weight of law and inevitability, turning the moment of artistic triumph into a confrontation between past and future. The audience's reaction was immediate and chaotic, wealthy patrons scrambling for exits while others remained frozen in their seats, uncertain whether they were witnessing theater or reality. Céleste stood center stage in her emerald gown, her voice now silent but her presence commanding as she positioned herself between Lucien and the marshal, her courage transforming her from performer into protector. "Those men he killed were trying to rape and murder innocent women," Céleste said, her voice carrying across the theater with the same power that had just moved the audience to tears. "Lucien never killed anyone who didn't deserve killing. Never took a life that wasn't threatening someone else's life or honor. If that's murder, then every decent man in the territories is a criminal." Her defense was passionate and articulate, turning the theater into a courtroom where justice would be determined by truth rather than legal technicalities. Lucien stepped forward with his hands visible but not raised, his posture showing respect for the law while maintaining the dignity of a man who had found something worth more than survival. "I won't run any more, Marshal," he said quietly, "but I won't be taken away from the woman I love without the truth being heard. Every man I killed had a choice: leave innocent people alone or face the consequences. They chose violence, and I gave them what they chose." The standoff stretched across long seconds as Marshal Cole evaluated the situation, his professional judgment warring with the evidence of transformation that stood before him in the form of a killer who had become a composer and a woman whose courage was redefining everything he thought he knew about justice and redemption. The decision he made would determine not just Lucien's fate, but the future of American frontier justice itself. What followed was the most unusual trial in San Francisco's history, as the Golden Gate Opera House was transformed into a courtroom where witness after witness testified to Lucien's character and the circumstances of his alleged crimes. Marcus Whitman used his considerable influence to ensure that the proceedings were fair and public, understanding that the outcome would determine whether art could triumph over violence in America's cultural development. The prosecution's case seemed strong on paper, 17 dead men and a defendant who admitted to killing them all. But it crumbled under the weight of testimony from witnesses who painted a picture of a man who had consistently used violence only to protect the innocent from predators who terrorized frontier communities. Each killing had been justified, each confrontation had been forced upon Lucien by men who gave him no choice between violence and allowing innocent suffering. Celeste's testimony was the most powerful, her voice carrying the same emotional impact in the courtroom that it had on the stage as she described how Lucien had protected her from men who saw her vulnerability as an opportunity for exploitation. "He could have used me for his own purposes," she said, her words reaching every corner of the packed theater. "Instead, he taught me to protect myself while helping me find my voice. That's not the behavior of a criminal. That's the behavior of a man who understands the difference between strength and violence." The defense that emerged was revolutionary for its time. The argument that some men were forced into violence by the failure of legal institutions to protect the innocent, and that such men deserved redemption when they used their skills to build rather than destroy. Lucien's transformation from killer to composer became evidence that human beings were capable of change when given the opportunity and motivation to pursue better lives. But the most dramatic moment came when Marshal Cole himself took the stand and admitted that his investigation had revealed the truth about Lucien's victims. They had all been predators whose deaths had made frontier communities safer for decent people. "I came here to arrest a killer," Cole testified reluctantly. "But I found a man who stopped killing when he found something better to do with his life. That might not be legal justice, but it might be something more important." The jury's deliberation lasted less than an hour, their verdict reflecting not just legal judgment, but a community's recognition that justice sometimes required looking beyond the letter of the law to the spirit of human redemption. "Not guilty on all charges," the foreman announced, his words releasing tension that had built not just in the courtroom, but throughout San Francisco as citizens debated the nature of justice and the possibility of transformation. The celebration that followed was unprecedented in the city's history, as the same audience that had come to hear music found themselves witnessing the birth of a new understanding of American justice, one that recognized the difference between necessary violence and criminal violence, between men who killed for profit and men who killed to protect the innocent. Celeste and Lucien were no longer just performers, but symbols of the possibility that love could transform even the most violent men into forces for good. Marcus Whitman's offer of a permanent contract was renewed with even better terms, recognizing that the publicity from the trial had made them the most famous musical partnership in the American West. Theaters across the country were requesting bookings, critics were hailing their music as the beginning of a uniquely American musical tradition, and recording companies were competing for the rights to distribute their songs to a national audience. But the most important moment came when Marshal Cole approached them after the verdict, his weathered face showing emotions that lawmen rarely allowed themselves to display. "I've spent 20 years bringing killers to justice," he said quietly, "but I've never seen one become something better than what he was. Maybe there's hope for this frontier after all, if enough people can find what you two found together." The handshake between hunter and hunted marked the end of one chapter in their lives and the beginning of another, as Lucien finally laid down the burden of his violent past and embraced a future built on creation rather than destruction. The wild cowboy had been truly tamed, not by force or law, but by love, and the discovery that his talents could build beauty instead of delivering death. The months that followed their legal vindication saw Celeste and Lucien's artistic partnership flourish beyond their wildest dreams. As their music began reaching audiences across America through recordings and touring performances that brought Western themes to Eastern stages. Their love story had become part of their artistic appeal, with newspapers calling them The Taming of the West and Love's Triumph Over Violence. Lucien's transformation was complete, his guns replaced by conductors' batons, and his reputation for deadly accuracy replaced by recognition as one of America's most innovative composers. The same intensity that had made him lethal now drove him to create music that captured the full emotional range of frontier experience. From the loneliness of vast spaces to the joy of human connection in an untamed land. Céleste's voice had found its perfect vehicle in Lucien's compositions, her classical training providing the technical foundation for music that told uniquely American stories with European sophistication. Critics compared her to the greatest sopranos of Europe while recognizing that she was creating something entirely new, an American voice that spoke to both educated elites and common people who had lived the experiences her songs described. Their wedding was held on the stage of the Golden Gate Opera House, with Marshal Cole serving as Lucien's best man in a gesture that symbolized the transformation of frontier justice from revenge to redemption. The ceremony was followed by a concert that featured their most popular songs, turning their personal celebration into a public affirmation of love's power to transform even the most unlikely people into forces for good. But the most meaningful moment came during their honeymoon in the mountains above San Francisco, when Lucien played for Céleste the song he had been working on throughout their courtship, a ballad that captured not just his love for her, but his gratitude for the way she had shown him that his hands could create beauty instead of dealing death. As her voice joined his melody in perfect harmony, both of them understood that they had found something more precious than fame or fortune. They had found the music that lived in the space between two hearts beating in perfect time. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning when the San Francisco fog was thick enough to muffle sound and hide threats, delivered by a nervous messenger who refused to wait for a reply or even give his name. Céleste found it slipped under their dressing room door at the Opera House, her hands trembling as she recognized the handwriting that had once meant safety, but now carried only menace. "The Moreau family debt has not been forgotten," the letter read in the careful script of someone accustomed to writing death sentences. "Your father's crimes against decent society demand payment, and his daughter's success only increases the interest owed. You have 7 days to return to Louisiana and face the justice your family escaped. Refuse, and your new husband will learn what happens to those who protect thieves and their spawn." The signature was one that made Céleste's blood run cold. Auguste Beauregard, her father's former business partner, and the man whose testimony had sent Auguste Moreau to federal prison before his death behind bars. Beauregard had been the real architect of the slave trading operation, but he had escaped prosecution by providing evidence against his partner while keeping his own involvement hidden behind legal technicalities and political connections. Lucien's reaction to the threat was immediate and familiar, the careful alertness of a man whose survival instincts had been honed by years of violence. His hand drifting toward weapons he no longer wore while his eyes scanned their surroundings for potential threats. The transformation from composer back to gunfighter was subtle but complete, reminding Céleste that the wild cowboy she had tamed was still there beneath the civilized surface, waiting to emerge when protection was needed. "He's afraid," Lucien said after reading the letter multiple times, his analytical mind working through the implications of the threat with professional precision. "Your success has made you visible, and visibility means people are asking questions about your family's story. He's worried that your fame will eventually lead to investigation of the real criminals behind your father's operation." The assessment was accurate but provided little comfort, because a frightened enemy with political connections was often more dangerous than an honest one with superior firepower. Auguste Beauregard's reach proved to be longer and more sophisticated than either of them had anticipated. As professional killers began arriving in San Francisco with the kind of resources and coordination that suggested federal backing rather than private vengeance. These weren't the crude bounty hunters who had pursued them across the territories, but experienced assassins whose methods involved subtlety and plausible deniability rather than open confrontation. The first attempt came during a performance at the Opera House, when a chandelier that had been sabotaged crashed onto the stage moments after Celeste had moved to a different position during her aria. The incident was investigated as an accident, but Lucien's examination of the rigging revealed cut cables and carefully placed charges that could have been triggered remotely by someone with military engineering experience. Their hotel room was burglarized the next night, but nothing was stolen. Instead, their belongings had been carefully searched and rearranged by someone looking for evidence or planning future operations. The message was clear. They were being watched, studied, and prepared for elimination by professionals who understood that fear was often more effective than immediate violence in breaking their target's resolve. Lucien's response was to revert to tactics from his gunfighter days, varying their routes and schedules while teaching Celeste skills she had hoped never to need: how to recognize surveillance, how to identify potential weapons in innocent surroundings, and how to move through crowds in ways that made targeting difficult for snipers or poisoners. The lessons were conducted with the same patient precision he had once used to teach her musical techniques, but the subject matter was life and death rather than artistic expression. The realization that their new life was being systematically destroyed by enemies who understood that direct confrontation was too risky forced them to consider options that seemed to betray everything they had built together. They could run again, abandoning their success and returning to the dangerous anonymity of the frontier, or they could fight back, using methods that would transform them back into the violent people they had worked so hard to leave behind. The choice between flight and fight was made for them when Auguste Beauregard's agents escalated their campaign from intimidation to direct assault, using an explosive device that destroyed their hotel room while they were attending a late dinner meeting with potential investors in their recording company. The blast that could have killed them both served as final proof that running would only delay the inevitable. Their enemy intended to see them dead regardless of where they tried to hide. Lucien's transformation back into the angel was swift and complete, his composer's hands once again wearing gun leather, while his strategic mind began planning operations that would have impressed military professionals. But this time, he wasn't fighting alone. Celeste insisted on being trained as his partner rather than just his protected asset, her courage and intelligence making her a formidable ally when properly prepared for combat. The weapons training took place in the basement of Marcus Whitman's Opera House, the theater owner having revealed that his own past included military service and covert operations that had prepared him for exactly this kind of situation. "Art is worth fighting for," Whitman declared as he provided them with weapons and tactical advice. "And people who would destroy artists to protect their own corruption deserve whatever violence comes their way." Their counterattack began with intelligence gathering, using Celeste's social connections among San Francisco's elite to identify Beauregard's local assets, while Lucien's old contacts among frontier lawmen provided information about the assassination team's background and capabilities. The combination of high society access and underworld knowledge created opportunities that neither could have achieved alone. The revelation that came from their investigation was more disturbing than they had expected. Beauregard's operation was being funded and coordinated by corrupt federal officials who saw the couple's success as a threat to their own crimes, making this not just a personal vendetta, but a systematic effort to suppress evidence that could expose government corruption reaching into the highest levels of power. The fight they were about to begin would determine not just their own survival, but the future of justice in America itself. The trap they set for Beauregard's assassins was as carefully choreographed as any opera, using a special performance at the Golden Gate Opera House to draw their enemies into a controlled environment where Lucien's tactical advantages would be maximized. The audience believed they were attending an exclusive concert, but they were actually witnessing the opening act of a deadly drama that would determine whether art could triumph over corruption. Celeste stood center stage in a gown of pure white silk, her voice soaring through the aria that Lucien had composed specifically for this moment. A song about justice and redemption that served as both artistic expression and tactical signal to allies positioned throughout the theater. Every note was perfect, every phrase carried emotional weight that moved the audience to tears. But Lucien's attention was focused on the shadows, where death waited for its moment to strike. The attack came during the final crescendo, as three assassins moved through the audience with weapons concealed among formal evening wear, their plan being to eliminate both targets during the confusion that would follow gunshots in a crowded theater. But Lucien had anticipated their tactics, and his response was swift and lethal. 3 shots from his concealed position in the orchestra pit, each one finding its target with the precision that had made him legendary among frontier gunfighters. The audience's panic was controlled by allies who had been positioned to guide civilians to safety while preventing the assassin's escape, turning the theater into a carefully managed battlefield where innocent people were protected while justice was delivered to those who threatened them. Marshal Cole emerged from the audience with federal warrants for the surviving members of Beauregard's network. His investigation having provided the legal framework for what Lucien's guns had accomplished through direct action. But the most dramatic moment came when Auguste Beauregard himself appeared on stage, his own weapon drawn as he prepared to finish personally what his hired killers had failed to accomplish. "You should have stayed hidden," he snarled at Celeste, his voice carrying years of hatred and fear. "Your family destroyed my life, and I'll be damned if I let your success restore a name that should have died with your father." The confrontation that followed would determine whether the past could destroy the future or whether love and courage could triumph over hatred and corruption. The final confrontation played out like the climax of a tragic opera, with Beauregard's accusations and threats providing a dark counterpoint to Celeste's unwavering dignity as she faced the man who had destroyed her family while hiding his own crimes behind false testimony and political connections. "My father made mistakes," she said, her voice carrying across the theater with the same power that had made her famous. "But he never sold children into slavery or arranged the murder of witnesses who might expose the truth." Beauregard's response was to raise his gun toward Celeste, but Lucien was already moving with the deadly grace that had made him the most feared gunfighter in the territories. The shot that followed was inevitable, necessary, and final. Auguste Beauregard died on the stage of the Golden Gate Opera House, his corruption and hatred ending where truth and beauty were meant to flourish. The silence that followed the gunshot was broken by applause as the audience realized they had witnessed not just the death of a villain, but the triumph of justice over corruption, art over violence, and love over hatred. Celeste's voice rose once more in the aria that Lucien had written for this moment, a song about redemption and new beginnings that transformed the theater from a place of violence back into a temple of artistic expression. Marshal Cole's investigation revealed the full scope of Beauregard's criminal network, leading to arrests and prosecutions that cleaned out corruption in federal law enforcement while vindicating everyone who had been persecuted for standing up to organized crime. The evidence gathered during their ordeal became the foundation for reforms that would protect future witnesses and ensure that federal power could never again be used to silence truth. But the most important victory was personal, rather than political, as Lucien holstered his guns for the final time and walked to center stage where Celeste waited with tears of relief and gratitude streaming down her face. The wild cowboy had protected his lady one last time, and now he could truly become the composer he was meant to be, creating beauty instead of delivering death, building dreams instead of ending lives. 5 years later, the Beauregard Opera Company had become the most celebrated musical institution in the American West, with Céleste and Lucien's collaboration having spawned a whole school of composers and performers who brought Western themes to audiences across the nation and around the world. Their love story had become legend, inspiring countless songs and stories about the power of art to transform even the most violent hearts. The final performance of their anniversary season took place on the same stage where they had fought for their lives and their love. But now the Golden Gate Opera House was filled with music instead of gunfire, hope instead of fear, celebration instead of survival. Céleste stood center stage in a gown of gold and silver, her voice more beautiful than ever as she performed the aria that had become their signature piece. The song about taming wild hearts through the power of love and music. Lucien conducted from the orchestra pit, his hands guiding musicians through the complex harmonies he had spent 5 years perfecting, his music now reaching audiences on every continent, as recordings and sheet music spread their unique blend of classical sophistication and frontier authenticity around the world. The guns that had once made him feared now gathered dust in a locked cabinet, replaced by conductors' batons and composers' pens. In the audience sat Marshal Cole, now retired and serving as the couple's business manager, his law enforcement experience having proved invaluable in protecting their artistic empire from those who would exploit or destroy it. Beside him sat Marcus Whitman, whose investment in their talent had made him wealthy while proving that art and commerce could support each other when guided by genuine appreciation for beauty and truth. As the final notes of their anniversary concert faded into silence, Lucien joined Céleste center stage for the duet that had become their trademark closing number, a song about two hearts finding harmony despite impossible odds, about love's power to transform violence into beauty, and about the music that lives in the space between souls who have learned to sing together. The applause that followed seemed to go on forever, but for Lucien and Céleste, time had stopped in that perfect moment when art, love, and justice combined to create something more beautiful than either of them could have achieved alone. She had tamed a wild cowboy, but he had composed ballads for her voice, and together they had created music that would echo through generations of dreamers who believed that love could indeed conquer all.